Hello, everybody. My name is Arun Krishnamurthy. I'm a senior director at Dell Technologies. I lead our cybersecurity portfolio. Welcome to this LinkedIn Live event. We are super excited to talk about advanced cybersecurity and zero trust maturity, a very interesting topic. I am joined by some really high profile panelists here today. Super excited to have them. I'm going to do a little bit of introductions. We'll start with Teresa Payton. Teresa is the first female White House CIO, leading cybersecurity expert, and 2019 Women Cybersecurity Leader of the Year. As one of the nation's most respected authorities on cybersecurity, Teresa is also highly sought after keynote speaker in many events. She's a visionary in the digital world, leading the way as an inventor of new security designs and as an approved US patent in security. She generally captivates audience by drawing her experience as a veteran cybercrime fighter and entrepreneur and masterfully blending memorable anecdotes, real life experiences to make it real and give us cutting edge insights. Again, she made history as the first female White House Chief Information Security Officer and currently helps organizations in both public and private sectors. She was named one of the top 25 most influential people in security by Security Magazine, and she routinely participates in with a lot of news outlets like CNN, NBC, and other major outlets. I want to now switch to our second panelist, Hector Monsegur. He's a speaker. He's a former Black Hat researcher. He's the director of research at Alcarinet's Cyber Risk Department. He's an advisor. He's mentor. A little bit of background, interesting background with Hector. He was born and raised in Alphabet City, Lower East Side at New York City. He got involved earlier as a hacker subculture in the mid 90s. He was a former hacker and a member of the hacking group Lulzsec, an offshoot of the hacktivist group Anonymous. Initially, he was involved in high-profile cyber attacks against several government and private sector websites, but he transitioned his career in cybersecurity, used his skills to help organizations strengthen their security posture. He's a huge advocate of ethical hacking and cybersecurity education. And he's also the co-host of Hacker and the Fed podcast with the FBI agent who actually tried to arrest him in 2011. So awesome panelists between Teresa and Hector. Great to have you here. I'm also joined by Ash Lakshmanan, who's one of our senior product managers at Dell. He was instrumental in launching our Managed Detection Response Pro Plus offering earlier this year. He has a deep passion in the attack surface management area. Ash, I'm sure you're going to probe Hector for all his knowledge on this area. Ash has also built great partnerships with leading ecosystem vendors in the industry and instrumental in the Dell relationship with them. So super excited to have all three of you. I'm going to kick off with a general question to both Teresa and Hector. It's really a cat and mouse game, right? Cyber attacks do not stop. We know that. It's a cat and mouse game between the hackers and the cybersecurity professionals. Can you give us some insights on how hackers are adapting to the new measures that the cybersecurity professionals are taking and what's happening out there?
Sure, I'll start with this first. I think what's been incredibly interesting to me is to watch as organizations do a better job locking the doors, locking the windows, if you will, and improving their cybersecurity maturity models. Cyber criminals don't give up. They evolve their tactics. And so they are using generative AI, they're using newer technologies, and they are looking at the consumer accounts of individuals in the workplace. They are looking at their social media, Internet of Things devices, and just looking for new and unique ways to hit up everybody. The other thing is people need to understand is that cyber criminals could teach a master class in human user behavior. And they read the news and statistics like we do. And so what I'm observing is that cyber criminals seem to know that 90% of all internet traffic, more often than not is originating from a mobile phone, not a desktop, not a laptop. And they know that. They know the types of messages we are getting at work and at home. And they're getting insanely good at basically replicating those messages. They have very low language barriers now because they can tell generative AI, hey, do me a favor, write this convincing text message, have it sound like an American CEO who's both polite, professional, friendly, but in a little bit of a hurry. And generative AI will actually write a message. So I'm seeing them evolve and basically just say, by studying human user nature and studying the tools, leveraging and changing their tactics.
Yeah, I would say that Teresa definitely brought up some great points there, right? The use of AI has been interesting, especially in the case of social engineering, because one of the things that organizations do is they'll bring in a vendor to do or implement security controls. A lot of these controls are looking for specific key phrases or keywords, indicators that this might be a phishing campaign or a spam attempt rather. And so using AI, you're able to kind of create these very neutral messages that'll circumvent some of these controls, go right into the inbox, and give the attacker an opportunity. But in regards to the cat and mouse game, Arun, we've been doing this for a long time, right? I got involved in cybersecurity in the 1990s before it was called cybersecurity. And so the one thing that I'll tell you right now, historically, and this is from a former Black Hat's perspective, and that is that attackers will move around and navigate so long as their technologies, so long as their exploits are actually working. Okay, I'll give you some good examples. So back in the 90s, attackers would identify vulnerabilities in systems and software. They'll develop exploits, and within that community, these groups or these researchers would trade and sell their exploits. All right. We didn't have Bitcoin back then, so it was very hard to sell it. So there was a lot of trading. And so for a long time, you had a big 0-day marketplace. Okay. And you saw a lot of use of 0 days. It was very difficult for organizations to deal with that back then. But as time progressed and as organizations started installing AVs, and then we had EDRs eventually, right? And we had all these different really cool endpoint controls. You saw the shift away from the use of 0 days. It became privatized, and then they started looking at social engineering. So for a long time, we had social engineering become a real big thing, and then you had organizations deal with training and social engineering awareness and all of these cool concepts. And where are we today, Arun and Teresa and Ash? Now these attackers are going back to using 0 days again. Okay, so it just keeps evolving or keep evolving depending on what works at the time.
Yeah, they're pretty agile in terms of how to react.
Great, Hector. I mean, following up on what you just said, right? The threat landscape is also evolving quite a bit.
Oh, yeah.
And, reasons Teresa mentioned, we have new capabilities, GenAI, great for the SOC analyst, but also a tool that's available for everyone. Where do you see the new risks? Like when you look forward, right? When you look in the coming 5 years, what do you see are the trends from a risk standpoint?
Yeah, that is another great question because, as you know, threats are constantly evolving. The landscape is constantly evolving. I just gave you an example of how it goes back and forth between using 0 days or social engineering. Unfortunately, a lot of data points to insider threats being a big issue moving forward. There was a point where you could go, depending on the provider, you could go to a brick and mortar store for an ISP or a mobile or phone provider and speak to the guy behind the desk and say, hey, I'll give you $100 if you could swap this number for me, right? We saw a little bit of that in the mid 2010s when SIM swapping became very popular. A lot of those SIM swapping capabilities happened because exactly that. Employees were willingly giving out access to some of these service providers' internal technologies, which were externally accessible. And so, okay, you see things like that taking place. Obviously, social engineering is going to continue moving forward, especially with AI now. And then you're going to have researchers, what we call researchers, coming up with ways to use AI to mitigate or rather circumvent EDR technology. So what do we know about EDR technologies? They work very well, depending on implementation. They're fantastic. A lot of it has to do with behavior analytics. So if an attacker is breaking into a system and they're moving very much like a bull in a china shop, right, or just causing just havoc as soon as they end up on the endpoint, what you're going to have is you're going to have detections and anomalies just going off, right? And so what these attackers are probably going to do is use generative AI to kind of create payloads or build a methodology that will kind of seamlessly engage an endpoint without triggering too many anomalies or creating too many anomalies in the logs, right? You're going to see a lot of that take place as AI becomes more and more common, and the research capabilities are out there and more accessible, for sure.
Perfect. Teresa, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Sure. I agree with what Hector just said, and I'll add just a couple more things for everyone to consider. Especially Hector, to your point, we know that cyber criminals actually buy the same tools that organizations buy, and then they just keep testing against the tool to see, when do I get by and what does that look like? And then they evolve their tactics, right? And so the other couple of things I would like to mention, first is around, I have an ongoing concern around data lake poisoning and algorithm poisoning. And as we are using more generative AI, as we're using more behavioral-based analytics, whether it's anything from decision engines to looking for anomalies in infrastructure, my concern is that cyber criminals want an advantage. And the way they get that advantage is they methodically, through prompt engineering or through other methodologies, supply chain attacks, think something like a SolarWinds or Kaseya, they actually inject poison either into the algorithm when it's being trained. And because algorithms typically operate like black boxes, there's not somebody pulling it apart from time to time, popping the hood of the engine and really doing kind of governance and maker checker rules, that you could end up with unintended results and consequences. The same thing with data lakes. Many of these algorithms and the profiles and the decision making is based on a data lake. And many people often, I say people will look at data lakes and think that it's a carefully curated lake and that we've got data scientists and junior data scientists are doing the tagging. And you sort of picture this beautiful koi pond with lily pads, when instead it's kind of murky water. There's tires at the bottom, and there's a mix of professionals and not professionals, some with great intent, some well-intended but not trained, and then some with intentions, right? And so I've got some concerns there around that. And then the other piece is sort of voice cloning is nothing new, but interestingly enough, my first known case where I saw voice cloning successfully convince an organization to wire transfer money was back in 2019 while I was in Germany. Meeting with the European Council of Banks, they brought to me a case. We talked through the case, and everybody followed the rules. Everybody followed the processes. What they didn't anticipate is many of us have our voices in the public domain, and the cyber criminals, the fraudsters, were able to get the CEO's voice and enough snippets of it to use deep fake audio editing technology to carry on just enough of a convincing conversation with the CFO. They had clearly studied the CFO and the CEO to know pretty much, again, human nature. They study human user stories. They study our operations. So they know how the banks typically work. They know what the protocols are inside organizations. And the CFO who was duped by this voice cloning, this deep fake audio, even said at the time, the way that this particular CEO, English is not their first language, accentuates and pronounces certain words was spot on accurate. So the ability to do that, we have to, here's the thing, cyber criminals are not better and smarter than everybody. They're incredibly creative. And so what we have to do on our side, besides the tools, besides the architecture, is think to ourselves, they're going to expect me to do this, which is why I'm going to do something else. And where can we put sort of creativity into our people, process, and technology to be one step ahead of them?
Got it.
Yeah, Teresa, I think you bring up a great point. Actually, there's a couple of great points that came out of this discussion, right? One, it feels like Gen AI and those innovations are at least short-term going to help the hackers until the community figures out how we are going to solve for this. And the second one is just the relentless pursuit of innovation on the hacker side. They're always going to be try one step ahead. And the third important thing I think you surfaced is it's really a people process technology approach. Yes, the technologies are innovating fast clip, but let's not kid ourselves and just put all the eggs in just the technology basket. We have to have an holistic approach to this. Great insights there. So I'm actually going to switch topics a little bit. So when we at Dell talk to customers, especially from a journey standpoint, customers want to know where do we start, right? It's not that customers are on day one in the journey or day zero. They've had cybersecurity for decades, but they want to kind of reevaluate, where do I hit the reset button and revisit. Typically, the way we engage is we look at, okay, let's look at the blind spots you have today. Let's look at your attack surface. Let's lock that down. Let's then look at your detection response so you are really proactive about it. And let's not kid ourselves. In spite of the first two, there is going to be an attack. So let's prepare for that recovery. So I want to kind of break these three trends a little bit with you. Ash, I know you are one of our leading experts on the attack surface management. You've done a lot with our offers recently. Can you kick off a conversation here on what you're seeing and with the panelists?
Absolutely, Arun. So needless to say, right, the attack surface is expanding. We see that across the board. That comes with a function of the diversity of devices, that comes with a distributed workforce, that comes with things like, large macro trends, multi-cloud. You have, to the earlier point, not just your standard IT devices, you have your OT devices, your IoT devices, the convergence of physical and cybersecurity when you're protecting an environment. All these larger trends are expanding the attack surface for our customers. That's something that we see. The second element that kind of amplifies this challenge is the democratization of, cyber attacks, right? And hacking as a service is what I call it, right? Just like we have SaaS, you have hacking as a service, where you don't have to be a sophisticated operating system network expert sometimes to, push these attacks anymore. You can maybe procure these services, right? And procure even the software and the processes and the tools, just like you can procure it as a managed service. So all this conflates and makes the attack surface expanded. With that, I'm going to, take this to, Hector from a, bring a hacker mindset for us, which is, where is the lowest hanging fruit for a hacker right now, right? You have all these hundreds of tools in customer environments. Customers continue to invest heavily in cyber. Where is the low hanging fruit for these hackers? And, what is something that customers can do to help, push that hacker next door? Like, are there things you do upfront, simple things? What are the low hanging fruits here?
Yeah, so that's another fantastic question, Ash. I'm glad you asked. I mean, it can be daunting for organizations, whether it's enterprise or even an SMB, right, small to medium-sized business. Their concern is, well, is it going to be expensive to deal with some of these things? And I want to kind of tackle that question as well as we kind of move into this. So low-hanging fruits are the very obvious, and we've been talking about this stuff for 20 plus years, right? So we have issues like password management, and a big shout out to a lot of you guys. I know Dell is also involved in all this, but moving away from passwords and going into pass keys or using FIDO technologies, that's fantastic. So you have password issues, you have governance issues, you have employees that may have too much access, too much privileges on their workstations. Now they're working remotely. They're going to random websites from their work laptop. Now they're potentially opening the door for compromise. Okay. You're also looking at third-party breaches and that capability. You have the supply chain. You have, as you're bringing in, remember, Ash just brought up a good point. We're constantly expanding our attack surface. So every time you create a new account somewhere, or you add a new SaaS into your infrastructure, or you bring in a new vendor for a new product, you're constantly expanding what that looks like. Now, that opens the doors for your attackers. Now it gives the attackers a lot of opportunity to get access to what it is they want to access without having to access the target directly, right? I'll give you an example. When I was the bad actor, when I was, a black hat, when I was targeting foreign governments, and for the record here, that's really what I did for the most part. When I had to target a foreign government, I didn't necessarily go to soandso.gov.cn I would start targeting universities around it because the universities usually ran infrastructure. And then I would kind of move laterally into that foreign government. Okay. Attackers are doing the same exact thing here. Now, when you have, and you brought up a very good point as well, a lot of these hacker groups now and organizations aren't necessarily sophisticated as they probably were 15 years ago, right? They've broken operations into small pieces. For example, did you know, guys, I'm sure you guys know this, but it's for the audience really, did you know that ransomware groups, the way they operate is they don't necessarily just hack into your systems and start to extort you. There's actually someone else that comes before that. That's the initial access broker or initial access specialist. And these are people that scan your systems all day looking for the low-hanging fruits that Ash just mentioned. And once they're able to kind of get inside and leverage it, they'll sit on that access for X amount of time, hoping there's some sort of log rotation. And then they'll sell it to a ransomware group where those guys will come in and then start to engage. Now, the reason why we know that is when we're looking at data breach reports or incident reports that are released by organizations like the city of Dallas recently did a really good report. Definitely check that out if you can. What you see is that on an initial entry through a low-hanging fruit, the attackers are moving in a very specific way, executing very specific commands. And then X amount of time later, you have a ransomware group come in and it's just completely different commands, completely different methodology. And so this is how we know there are multiple groups involved. So how can organizations deal with that problem? Well, remember what I said earlier. This is not specific to big enterprises or massive corporations with security budgets and security programs. This also applies to SMBs, right? Organizations, mom and pop lawyer firms, and so on. We want to deal with the password problem. We want to deal with implementing MFA, obviously. We want to deal with some sort of security awareness training. This is October. Every October Security Awareness Month. Let's take advantage of it. Big shout out for Dell, to Dell for putting this together. Now we want to look at segmentation and micro segmentation. For example, you want to ask yourself a question. If our intern gets compromised, what's the worst case scenario, right? This is called a tabletop exercise. Now you're embracing asking questions, getting answers, and with those answers, you're able to determine gaps in your security program. Okay. And then you bring someone like Teresa in, who is this, she was a CIO for the White House. You have a CIO come in and start to build policies around those gaps. And if you have a CISO or an IT director, they can start to enforce Teresa's policies, right? These are all things that in hindsight might sound or currently might sound a bit daunting, but trust me, guys, as you start to develop these processes, as you start to start implementing these processes, you're going to see major differences. And now attackers who are looking for low-hanging fruits are not going to find them, and it's going to keep moving forward.
Hector, those are great insights you brought up there. Teresa, I'm going to probe you with this question, right? I think one of the tactic strategies that's been evolving, we hear a lot nowadays, is zero trust, right? How do I now, adopt a zero trust framework or an architecture? What are you seeing in the industry? Again, White House and DoD has been playing a big role. Dell ourselves have been participating with Project 4.0 with the DoD. Every vendor is talking about zero trust. Our customers are asking about it. What are your thoughts on zero trust and how it can be effectively implemented?
Sure. And just for people who are thinking about zero trust. So first of all, Dell, I love the work products you've been putting out on this to help people really unpack what does ZTA really mean. Hector actually gave some very practical steps to get started that help you along that journey. But I'm going to be very candid with everybody listening. I actually don't like the term zero trust architecture because I believe it implies it's a destination. And if only you buy the right products and solutions, you somehow arrive at this magical place once you achieve ZTA. And so I always like to talk about no trust architecture and creating within sort of a zone of no trust, understanding really those human user stories. And if the zone has to talk to another zone of responsibility, because this is how we thought about things at the White House, how do I do that sort of as a one-time, authenticate you in that moment? And the technology is a lot more seamless and a lot better now than what I had to work with back in the day. And how do we do that in a way so that it's constantly no trust, but we still enable the human user story to get done? Couple of statistics for everybody. If you're feeling like you're lagging behind everyone, let me just say to you, if it were easy to implement no trust architecture or zero trust architecture, you would have already done it, because I know you care about the job that you're doing. It's complicated. Many organizations, probably many of you listening in, have technical debt. And we all know that that technical debt may not actually work well in some of the products and solutions that have been built. So take that business case, go one human user story at a time. If you want further proof, so if you want to have this conversation with your chief risk officer or your C-suite executives, PwC just put out a great 2023 report, the Global Digital Trust Insights Report. And only about 36% of CISOs that responded to their survey said they're on their journey of doing zero trust architecture. Note, I didn't say finished it, implemented all of the concepts of it. And 25% of respondents said they plan to get started in the next 24 months. So if you haven't started, you're not alone. I would actually go with a lot of the basics that Hector said in the earlier response to the question, because those will, the playbook, doing a playbook, practicing a digital disaster will actually show you your blind spots where you've got people, process, and technology missing. And as you make your priorities around filling in those gaps, you will actually be starting your no trust or your zero trust architecture journey. The other thing I would just say is, look for those areas where you can redesign the human user story. So things like multi-factor authentication, putting that into place. And then if you assume that somebody's going to exfiltrate your data, that somebody's going to get access to your data, you're going to store it a little differently. Maybe look at your opportunities in that human user story to implement encryption for data that's in storage and data that's in motion. So those would be just some of the things that I would recommend on top of what Hector already mentioned.
Yeah, again, Teresa, great insight there. I think from a Dell standpoint, we are very consistent with like how you define the adoption of zero trust. When we talk to customers, we talk about cyber hygiene, we talk about risk. And yes, we talk about zero trust, but we talk about zero trust in terms of a logical way of organically maturing the overall layered security. So I want to quickly pivot to another topic. We talked about attack surface management, some of the zero trust. Let's look at detection response, right? I think there's a lot of things going on there. We think of dwell time. We think of hackers coming in and staying there for a long time. Hector, I would love your insight here. How should organizations plan for detection and response? What is the role of AI/ML? What is the role of people, process, playbooks, and even visibility across the enterprise from a detection and response perspective? Hector, Teresa, either of you can.
Oh, I thought you was asking Teresa. My bad. Yeah. So detection and response is quite complex, right? For any organization, small or large. In terms of detection, there's a few things that I do, especially on debrief calls with clients after I engage or finish a red team engagement with them. I start to look at the gaps that they have. I start looking at whether or not they have identified my actions or activity. And then, of course, we're looking at, well, if this was a real world engagement, a campaign against your organization, well, how did you fare, right? Now, based off of those conversations, we start to look at some of the faults that I've seen in most organizations. And so what are we looking at, right? And we can also compare this to the recent ransomware campaigns that we've seen. We've seen that some of the ransomware victims have security programs. They have CISOs, they have CIOs, they have the technologies to detect some of this stuff or even respond to some of this stuff. But then the ransomware still kind of works. It still kind of moves forward. In terms of detection, we want to look at some gaps here. One, if an attacker is able to get inside the network, how are we able to detect their activity online, or rather internally? Do we have a SOC team? Do we have SIMs and centralized logs? Are we having people look at those logs and determine if there are anomalies that are indicators of compromise? Okay. Then we also have the network segment of it. This might involve your network engineering team. It might also involve maybe an NDR or similar. But if someone breaks into our network, are we able to detect whether or not they're trying to make outbound connections? Hence, can we spot and even intercept or stop an exfiltration attempt? Remember, when you break down a ransomware campaign, there is that initial entry, there is the lateral movements and privilege escalation, right? And then, of course, there's the exfiltration, there's the egress, data transfers. Now, can we detect those things? And if not, what is it that we need to do to detect those things, right? So I think organizations have to really sit down and look at how their network is kind of set up, how it's developed, how it's implemented, what policies correlate to those different segments of the network. And then, of course, when it comes to response, that's a bit different. We've seen organizations that, again, have no security program, have an intermediate security program, and have sophisticated security programs deal with the response and recovery section in different ways. So let me tell you, from my perspective, what I'm seeing in the real world, okay? I'm seeing that clients may invest or set up some sort of backup solutions in the event ransomware happens. That's great. Do they have redundancy? Well, in most cases, they don't have redundancy. In many cases, they have those backup systems connected to Active Directory. Now, if an attacker compromises Active Directory and they get active domain administrator privileges, what do you think happens when they have domain administrative privileges over the backup systems that are connected to that network or that domain, right? That's problematic. And then, okay, so let's say we do have redundancy in the backup solutions and we're able to kind of recover and respond back to that incident. How fast can we get back online, right? Now you're dealing with business impact, business continuity, and then of course, what happens once we have identified the breach, and how do we deal with notifications? Because I'm sure some of you guys know here that the SEC has some new rules. If you're a publicly traded company, now you have to notify the SEC in the form of a Form K report within 4 days of your breach. So you need playbooks, you need a team, you need delegation, and you need policy to deal with the discovery, detection, response, and notification post-compromise. It's complex.
I'm going to switch to Teresa a little bit. So Teresa, as a CIO, right, you probably were routinely asked to do more with less. And we also touched on the fact that cybersecurity is not a problem for the high-end businesses. It really cuts across all segments, all lives, all users. What recommendations do you have for smaller organizations that may have a smaller team, constrained budget, constrained staff? What do you see? What recommendations do you have for them?
Sure. The good news is there are service providers like Dell and others that smaller organizations can tap into. So if you're trying to figure out, and sometimes you're a small security team within a large organization, but the budget just hasn't really been allocated at this point. So a couple of things to think about. One, once you do that playbook and you do your incident response playbook for ransomware, data exfiltration, distributed denial of service, some type of reputation risk, you're going to see the areas where internally you don't have the capabilities, you don't have the priorities, and maybe you don't have the budget. That can be a great place to start and say, what are my kind of executives' top 3 nightmares when I talk to them and say, hey, what's something that if this were to happen digitally tomorrow would be a disaster for the organization? What are your nightmares? What's the thing you're afraid of happening? And then you understand that nightmare, you prioritize the gaps that you have that could actually enable that nightmare to happen. And then you look for opportunities to RFP to different solutions providers. So one thing could be, hey, maybe we ask an outsourced group to have our logging for user logins, for our logging for our EDR, logging for different basic things, and ask them to check a few basic things. For example, are my failed login attempts trending in such a way that either all my employees just have spring fever, or right now, I guess it would be pumpkin spice fever, or are these failed login attempts and basically showing me that somebody is trying to get into our organization using password credential stuffing, right? And so have an outsourced group who can have your logs stored out of band, encrypted in case you have to do an investigation. You don't have to log everything if you're trying to on a constrained budget, but pick those most critical areas based on your playbooks, based on your executives' nightmares, and start by prioritizing those. Once you get those underhand, you can just continue to exercise those and move on to the second nightmare and the third nightmare. That's really how I would recommend addressing it, because now you can build a business case in your executive's own language. They're more likely to hear you out, more likely to look at, hey, if I'm not going to spend $1 on building the marketing or R&D of the company, and I will spend it on security to protect the company, where will I spend it? The other thing I would say is, and Hector mentioned this before, those logs, those backups, you have to store them out of band. You want to make sure they're encrypted, and also have a process for these. I've been incredibly impressed to hear about different organizations that do backup, restoral, and resiliency plans, where they actually tell the client, here are the people that you've authorized as people who are allowed to tell us, get some type of a backup or log out of storage. We're going to do a quick video conference. I'm going to set eyes on you, and I'm going to ask for a passphrase that's not easily guessed by cyber criminals, because cyber criminals, again, know that we have stored our backups encrypted out of band with services providers, and they are socially engineering them too. So looking for these very simple ways that don't cost money, it just costs time, education of your executives, education of your staff, and they can really go a long way and make a huge difference. You can get a lot done and do more with less that way.
Yeah, no, that's great insight. Teresa, I think one of the cool things you brought up was, I know when a lot of customers think cybersecurity, they immediately gravitate towards technology. I think one of the very important things, I think both you and Hector have emphasized here, is the need for scenario-based planning, right? What if this, what if that? I think that type of scenario-based planning naturally leads to, where are the current gaps, how sufficient we are, or even if we have a technology, are we making full use of it in terms of features and functionality? That was great insight. I know we touched on recovering. I know we talked about attack surface management, zero trust. We talked a little bit about detection response. I want to quickly pivot to recovery. I know we touched it, but really quick. We, Dell, have been talking to customers. We innovated what we call our cyber recovery solution, which really helps that offline vault to keep data safe. What do you see in terms of recovery planning for a lot of organizations? And how do organizations think of recovery? Do they kind of like, is it a Hail Mary thing, or do they actually plan these different scenarios? What do you see?
You know, one thing I'll mention is not all recovery and resiliency efforts are exactly the same for each line of business. And so what you want to do in advance, and this is something you can do as part of your business continuity planning, you don't have to have a digital disaster to have a business continuity event, is to really understand recovery time objectives. Everybody cannot have an 8-hour recovery time objective. And this is something I learned in my time in financial services. We had to force rank systems, which is very hard to do. You know, do we want deposits first and ATM second? Everybody wants both, is sort of at the same recovery time objective. And so you have to force rank, you have to prioritize. And since time is money, when you're doing resiliency and recovery efforts, time is money there too, as in more expensive. The faster you have to go, the more expensive it is. Same thing with resiliency. If you have to have 5 times the typical redundancy to make sure you have resiliency, it's going to be more expensive. And so, what I see organizations prioritizing, if they prioritize their business continuity plan first and their recovery time objectives, that can naturally be great foundational elements for your incident response plan. An incident response plan that is not grounded in business continuity planning, in business resiliency planning, recovery time objectives, you end up having sort of the scattershot effect, and you're trying to recover everything at the same time versus having an agreed to in advance, without emotion, not an emergency process. And because emotions are very high when you're in a resiliency and recovery mode, especially if it's public facing systems and it's very obvious to the whole world what's going on. So you want to have kind of map that out before the anxiety and the emotions are really high. One thing I think that's incredibly interesting in using generative AI, using AI algorithms and predictive analysis, I'm seeing kind of the more advanced organizations, which means this will be available for small and mid-sized businesses very soon, where they're using AI and machine learning now, and they're analyzing sort of historical data to predict if there's a potential disruption, if there's a DDoS against this system, if there's a data exfiltration against this system, what it actually may feel like in terms of downtime and financial impact. So I believe leveraging these technologies to actually have a more realistic simulation and a more realistic calculation of what the financial impact and reputation impact is, that will also help better inform how you focus on this, because it can feel overwhelming, but it really doesn't have to be.
Yeah, Teresa, I completely agree with you. One of the most robust practices we have at Dell is what we call our application portfolio practice. We routinely help customers with a BIA. And one of the interesting things we have found out with the BIA process is when we ask the owners how critical your app is, everybody said it's the most critical. So we have some very unique IP we have built in terms of really getting to that answer without asking end users, or do you have the most critical application? I think you bring up a great point. Tiering and prioritization is super critical. I'll take it one step further. We also find that there are application system dependencies that have to be worked out. Sometimes it's a little bit of a spaghetti, and we have to unwind that spaghetti and make sure that certain tier one processes and applications have a little bit of a clear-cut infrastructure dependency that we can float those applications both. And the other thing I want to talk to you about is we've taken an integrated resiliency and security approach in our practice. And I think what you both resonated was business continuity, disaster recovery, security, and the whole infrastructure architecture kind of all go hand in hand. So great insights from you. I would like you both to have give you an opportunity for a closing statement for our audience, part with some wise wisdom from you. We'll start with you, Teresa. What do you have for our audience here?
Yeah, well, first of all, since you were listening today, you're off to a great start. And Dell, just congratulations on kicking off a great October National and International Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Again, cybersecurity often feels like, to me, that the last thing we actually think about is the human doing their job or living their life. And we're very well intended, but we don't focus on why is the human using technology to begin with? We tell them, don't click on links or open an attachment. Well, that's part of their job. Like, can you imagine if I told President George W. Bush I was ignoring email today because it was unsafe? And so I really want us to all think about how can we take a step back. The last closing thought I'll leave you with is when I was in financial services and at the White House, I used to bring in adult learning specialists to help us think through whether it was policy rollouts, cybersecurity awareness training, or even actually changing the interface of how the technology worked. And one thing I took away from that was they said it's easier for adults to remember the things that you will never do versus telling them all the things that you're going to be doing. So I'll give you just a quick example. I actually, in my all hands meeting for my company yesterday, because social engineering emails are flying past all of our defenses and all of our filters, they're very convincing and they're just flying into our in basket. So I got the whole company together yesterday and I told them, here are the things that I will never do in email. I told them I don't like email. I will never communicate with my own employees using email. I find it very impersonal and very analog. My preference is in person. If I can't do in person, I like video conferences. If I can't do video conferences, I'll do a phone call. And then my last resort is to use our encrypted, lockdown, secure messaging platform that we use. I will never engage you on email and ask you to do something for me. And when in doubt, pick up the phone and call me. I'll never text you that way. I'll never email you that way. And now there's a whole channel in my company of all the emails and text messages from me. And everybody knows it's not me right away because I told them this is how I would and would not communicate with them. So think about, for yourself, for your organization, employees, your executives, and even your customers, Is there a way for you to spell out for them? Like we did this in banking. We said, we will never email you or text you, ask you to click on a link and type in your credentials. That is a red flag that it's not us. Pick up the phone, look at the back of your ATM card that we issued you, and call us directly. So that's what I'd leave everybody with.
That was
Awesome.
fantastic. Yeah, I love that. A big shout out to you, Teresa. You've done some great work, and I love your messaging for sure. What I like about this conversation, a big shout out to Fidel, Arun, and Ash for getting us together here, is that they were able to bring together two people that are part of the same industry, that are trying to help the same people, but we're from the different sides of the aisle, different sides of the conversation, but we still have the same, purpose in mind, right? I like that we as a community could sit down and have these conversations. Every time Dell does something, a webinar, an event, show up to it. You have to take advantage of the community. You have to interact and network, because if you are an isolated island and you're not really accepting information that's coming into you regarding new threats, you're not looking at the tools that are available out there to you, if you're not building relationships and networking within the industry, and finally, you're not taking advantage of your vendor relationships, you're doing yourself a disservice at the end of the day, right? For example, you see Arun here, you see Ash here. These gentlemen are professionals. They have a good understanding of the risks that you're facing. A conversation goes a long way with either one of them, right? If you see Teresa at one of her events, or you go to her business, sitting down and talking to her when she has time, hey, Teresa, here's what I'm dealing with. Here's the situation I have. What would be your approach, right? At the end of the day, each and every one plays a part. Each and every one of us plays a part in the overall security posture of our organizations, but also of our country, right? With all the geopolitical stuff happening in the world, not to get into it, if there ever was a major conflict, it's not necessarily going to be the big companies and corporations that are going to be targeted. It's going to be all the small businesses that make up the supply chain all across the country that will make an impact. Now, with that being said, security is not easy. It's not supposed to be easy, right? It's also not cheap, and it's not expensive. It's somewhere in the middle. You need to figure out what works for you. And identifying your gaps and understanding what your risk is and what your risk appetite is going to take you a very long way. Understanding your capabilities and speaking to your team and knowing where you guys stand also helps. And I want you all really to kind of, work together and figure this out, and don't be afraid to ask questions. We're here for you. Reach out whenever. Thank you, guys.
Fantastic. Hector, Teresa, Ash, thank you very much for your time. You're really brought a lot of wisdom here today for our audience.